Welcome to part three in a three-part series, Using Digital to Grow Your Practice. It is being presented by Jimmy Stegall, MBA, CDT. Tonight is part three, Implants and Patient Education. And with that, it is my extreme pleasure to introduce Jimmy Stegall, MBA, CDT. He is a seasoned dental lab operations and management executive with more than 43 years of teaching and clinical experience in the US and Canada. He is a published author and has assisted in research projects with dentists, universities, and manufacturers. After a successful 35-year career helping to build and lead a large dental lab in South Carolina, Jimmy is now a national procedural solutions specialist for Dentsply Sirona, where he has provided more than 400 clinical and laboratory educational events. As a key opinion leader, teacher, and trainer, Jimmy has demonstrated a history of providing relaxed, informative, results-oriented strategies and techniques to dental practices and labs throughout the United States. And now it is my pleasure to say, take it away, Jimmy.
Thanks, Jess. Hope everybody's doing well. How y'all doing? All right, round three. We're gonna oh, that's right. Got to have your disclosure so that your CE credits are validated. I do work for Dentsply. I'm not a commissioned employee, but just you need to know that to make the ADA AGD happy. So we're moving into the final phase, and tonight's discussion will be centered around implants and how we integrate them with digital. And we'll talk probably more about single tooth because that's the largest use of implants in the dental office today. All on four are full arches growing for sure, but single tooth abutments or single tooth implant restorations is by far number one. And in fact, the easiest way to integrate digital into those workflows. So we're going to talk about these things that you see and how they can help us. So it's not really just all about digital, even though digital kind of is a backbone for all the processes involved. We're going to talk about some, basics, some blocking and tackling about, making sure that our single tooth implants restorations are successful. So, we'll start with this, and this is just a representation of what none of us really want to see, right? When a patient's in the chair and they've got, some concerns and wondering, and you lift the lip and you see, the reason is that there's been some recession there, and we can now see the abutment or even maybe the interface between the abutment and the implant. And, it's not a good day in the dental office. It's not a good day for the patient, and something we certainly want to avoid. So that's kind of where my philosophy stands, is that, it's all about the end result, right? Patients don't come to us for implants, they come for teeth. And so, we need to do everything we can to, replace those lost spaces with teeth, as close to nature as we can recreate, because, that's what makes the best result. It's when we go outside of that, right? When we think about, how the root and how the CEJ and how everything interacts with the tissue and the profile of that tissue coming up from the root, all of that has a play in the implant restoration, and we certainly want that to mimic as closely as possible. And when we go outside of those boundaries, that's when we start to see the patient show up with the recession and the bone loss. Now, I'm not going to say that 100% because certainly, patient care has a lot to do with it, but I think we need to set the foundation, by building the platform exactly now how it needs to be. And so, one of my talks are centered around customization, right? And we talk about customization in a lot of aspects, and we're gonna hit each of those tonight. And the implant, of course, the customization of an implant all starts with a digital plan, right? So that we can figure out where that implant needs to be, ideally situated to provide the best support for the restoration. Now, the restoration itself, right? We have options. We could buy stock parts and pieces, or we can buy custom parts and pieces. And, I think the images here kind of represent, what the differences are, and how much of a challenge it is to use something stock and recreate profiles and support. I mean, it doesn't mean that it can't be done. Absolutely. We can take a stock part and modify it maybe. But it's a difficult thing to do. It's very difficult to take a stock part and make it truly custom to an implant site, to whatever the shape and contour of that tissue is. So custom, you'll soon realize, is certainly my favorite way of making sure things are done well. As far as the technicians go, we prefer custom for our restorations, because when you use a stock part, then you really kind of, you're cheating the system a little bit, in that, what we need for support, and, margins, how much room, all those things are associated with what's underneath. And a stock abutment is really going to provide better crown support for whatever type of crowns we choose to do. But in the clinical world, it all starts with the tissue. Right? The tissue has to be managed properly. Right. And the only way to do that is to make sure that the implants placed are good implants, right? We used to have a situation where there were implants that would actually cause bone loss. And I think we've moved past that. I think current generation of implants give us the tissue health and bone health that we're looking for. But uh, that used to be a real concern. And we've seen a lot of bone loss cases over the years. Now, when you see the case in the upper left and you think, what happened here? Patient seems relatively healthy. You don't see a lot of tissue inflammation. But the reason that this happened is primarily that lack of customization of the restoration. Implant placement may have been a little buckle, but the tissue, when this case started, was in the proper place. It was where you think it might be, up around that CEJ of that crown. But that crown had to be contoured pretty uniquely in order to make it look like a proper central. And it's not ideal when you have a small hole where the impression post was taken, and we've got to build something up and out of that hole to make it shape that crown. Then we start to create areas that things can go wrong. So, when I talk about, tissue, right? So many cases I would see that came up and it had that, just a straight tissue punch over the implant, and a good healthy tissue, great impression. I can see everything clearly, and the request was, make us a crown. So we kind of had to come up and out of that narrow hole of tissue and then flare out to make the restoration. And that's it, honestly, that's where the problem lies. And initially, I was pretty naive. I just assumed that patients would get up under there and clean any lip or shoulder, I call it, of those crowns. But we soon discovered that really is not the case. And so I quickly became a fan of, look, we really need to change this tissue. And so, worked a lot with the surgeons and periodontists to try to find ways to get this kind of tissue platform. Right? You want that socket to be as a natural, anatomically correct as we can get it, and not just a cylindrical hole. So as you can see on the middle and the right, we started getting those things, right? And I'll show you the various ways that we obtain that, but that's really the goal, right? If you're doing a single tooth implant, to get that kind of tissue formation is really should be everybody's goal. Because once you have that, right, and then you fill that space with something customized to match it, then you're going to have a way lower risk of any tissue recession, which of course leads to the bone loss. And so these were kind of the tools that I used. Sometimes they were stock, sometimes we customized things. And today, fortunately, there are a lot more things to pick from, like, stock healing abutments that are anatomically correct, right? They're shaped like the site of a bicuspid or a molar or even a central. And these are stock parts from one of the implant systems. This is a third-party part that a dentist put on the market that was one of my favorites for a long time, because it really creates, that's a bicuspid site from that's called Contour Healer. From that healing abutment. And so I became a huge fan of these and would just buy them up by the dozens and hand them out to all the surgeons or anybody I partnered with implant placement. Said, look, place the implant and then put this in for your healing. This is really going to make the tissue come nice. When we didn't have something like that, then we had to custom make it. And maybe it was just using a temporary cylinder and creating that custom cover type thing but shape it on the underside to get that tissue where we want it. Or sometimes patients wanted to have a tooth, a temporary tooth. So we made these custom temporary abutments and crowns assemblies that would create that tissue platform like we needed, so that we could proceed, with successful post, permanent restoration. And this is kind of a workflow of that, right? It was a plastic part, you kind of marginate it. You have to polish these things really, really well. You don't want anything not highly polished against the tissue as it heals. right? But I would make a temporary crown to go on this. We would cement the two, but leave the screw access hole. And you can see that, that turned out pretty good. They're in pretty good position. The screw access hole is there so that, if the tissue's not going the way we want it, it can come out of there, right? We can take that assembly out. We can polish it some more if that's what the problem might be, or if they're too big and bulky, we can cut them back down. You really want to have tissue engagement, right? The research has now proven to us that when we put something in an implant site, we want to have tissue engagement, meaning that whatever we put in there, we want to actually press into the tissue a little bit. And the general consensus is about a tenth, maybe two. It varies. And of course, it depends on the health of the tissue, but that means we're actually pushing against the tissue, which can be challenging at delivery, right? Because the tissue's fighting us, but it's really needed. If we don't engage the tissue with our restorations, then we see more tissue loss, right? But if we engage too much, we also see that tissue loss. The rule of thumb we always used was if we see blanching, right? Like in the upper left picture, if I see that blanching, then I kind of know I'm there. But if the blanching doesn't go away in 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, right, then we're pushing too hard. And so we've got to adjust and adapt. Now, with digital planning for implants, right, digital planning for the temporary restorations or the final restorations, we can know specifically if the data is good enough, like from a CBCT or a scan, we can know exactly how to engage that tissue to say that 1/10 of a millimeter. But visually, chairside, the blanching is always a good indicator. Now, one of the things that we also did is that once we were able to create that ideal tissue platform with a temporary of some sort, and then we're ready to get started for the final, we didn't just want to take a standard impression, right? We wanted to customize that impression post. So we started using things like, traditional impression post, but with maybe flowable composite around, or we would make a custom impression post outside of the mouth using the data that we'd already created through the building of the temporary. So customization is key, right? And it all starts with the plan. And I'm a firm believer of planning for implants. Digital planning software today really, really helps us a lot. And I think even single tooth implants ought to be planned with digital data, meaning a cone beam and a scan. The scan can be an intraoral scan, but can also be a scan of a model, right? We can take that data, put it into the software, and it can help us determine that ideal placement for that implant, which is customization of the implant placement. And all of the planning softwares are restoratively driven, meaning it's going to figure out, of course, where the bone and the nerves and everything is so that the implant, goes in the right spot, but it's also going to figure out where it needs to be and what angle it needs to be to support the restoration we want to put in the spot. And so if we customize that placement, we customize the tissue through some customization of some kind of temporary, and then we customize the impression, right? Then we need to put something in the space that's customized, right? Like an Atlantis abutment or a custom abutment. And these things are also prosthetically driven. They're designed with the final crown in mind, and they can be screw retained, they can be cemented, fully FDA validated, great warranties. And contrary to what some salespeople will tell you, screw retain restorations, third-party abutments work, right? And when you get FDA validation, you can't just say that, right? There's data to back it up. And with the Atlanta system, at least, which is what NDX uses, and they're really good at this, there's tons of studies, independent studies, that say that Atlantis abutments work on a variety of implant platforms. Matter of fact, they have FDA validation on 135 now, I believe. Less than 0.2% issue with screws. So I hear this in the market all the time that, yeah, when you buy that third-party abutment, the screws aren't good. No, you have to report these things. The FDA will get you. So the validation audits have proven over 3.5 million abutments that less than 0.2% have a problem with Atlantis. And it is a big red button. The workflow being all digital makes it super easy for the doctors in the lab to order. But this was my favorite part, right? When you do a custom abutment in a lab setting that you are going to design and create, right? These are kind of the bullet list of what you have to be thinking about, right? To make sure that all these things are in the proper places and all these boxes are checked properly. And so when I wanted to design an abutment that I was going to send to everybody except Atlantis, right? I had to make sure these things were done. Now, I used a computer to help me, but it was still up to me to make sure all these things were in place. Atlantis has a really unique aspect about it in that the design of Atlantis abutments are done not with CAD, which is what I just described, computer aided design, right? A person designing something with the aid of a computer, but VAD, meaning a computer designing abutment with the aid of a person. So it was AI before AI got cool, and VAD designs that abutment with all these check boxes, and then says to the designer, you know, is this right? Is this what you want? And right then we can tweak in our preferences that you might have. And you know, when we have that thing, right, we start eliminating and giving us options about what all can we do. And as Atlantis got more and more popular and grew, and they are the largest, but you know, adding features like angulated screw access so that we could do screw retained centrals and laterals and lower incisors really changed the game with the implant business. And of course, Atlantis is not the only one that has a lifetime warranty, but most people have a 10-year warranty. But Atlantis, again, is making it longer. And what you're looking for is a FDA validated, digitally adapted, developed implant abutment workflow. And Atlantis kind of leads the charge there. Now, on the clinical side, right, you know, we talked about this bone loss, and we know, you know, various ways it happened. But in the beginning, when I first started making implant crowns, they were all screw retained, every one of them. And somewhere along the line, after not too many years, it was determined by somebody somewhere that, hey, why don't we just make the implant abutment like a crown prep and then make the crown traditionally and just cement it on it. So we moved into a phase of cemented, and it quickly became popular. And there was a time when I would say 95% of the crowns were cement retained. And then a few short years later, this started to rear its ugly head, right? With the excess cement that you see here, we started seeing rapid and massive bone loss because of little flecks of cement that we just couldn't see and just didn't get cleaned out well. And now we have this term that we didn't have 15 years ago called periimplantitis, which is, you know, just the name for what we're looking at here. So if you go ask lab guys today, what percentage of your implant crowns are cemented and what percentage are screw retained, you're going to hear a complete reversal again. And now we're back in the 90th percentile of our crowns are being screw retained because of what you see in these pictures, right? Nobody wants to deal with this. And so, and we've gotten better with screw retained systems. So I see that more everywhere I go, and all the lectures around the country asking folks that, yeah, 85, 95% of our crowns are screw retained, and because nobody wants to deal with that. So screw retained can be multiple things. Just, there's lots of names for it, screw mendable, and that's really all marketing terms that came out. It's basically a crown custom made to fit something, glued together, and then you screw the whole assembly in the mouth. Now that something could be a stock part, right? That's kind of where they started, but it could also be a custom part, right? We could make a custom abutment like Atlantis custom base and make a crown over it, or it could be a kind of a hybrid of the two. And they typically call hybrid abutments where we buy or use a stock part and make a custom abutment top and then make a custom crown on top of that. And always worried about those a little bit, right? Because I've got two different cementing things going on, just more things that could come loose or break. So my favorite was a custom, but I went through a period where I did a lot of the stock parts, right? These were called originally tie bases, and several manufacturers came on the market with them, but they were very popular and still are, I would say, mainly because of the cost. They are a half to a third of what a custom abutment might be. So we can do them more affordable. And so, of course, you know, I jumped in this like everybody else did, and it was great. And what we didn't know at the time was that FDA validation was going to be a very important thing. FDA has hired more inspectors and gone after more implant systems, primarily on the abutment side, than anything else they've ever done in the last 50 years. And it's really what they're doing is they're just making sure that the labs are using FDA validated workflows so that what you're placing in the mouth is not going to cause any harm. Well, back then we really weren't thinking about that. We just assumed that all those boxes were checked. And so these tie bases, as it turns out, there turned out to be only one of them that had FDA validation. And we were using all these others because, you know, we wanted a better design or more retention or whatever, anti-rotation. And we just kept changing. And, I was in the midst of these things for maybe close to a year, 9 to 10 months before I finally gave up because I was having way too many calls with crowns loosening or screws loosening, or in fact, some things breaking. And I said, it's not worth the savings. So we went back to a more custom solution. And when I look back on it and I think about those little small, short, stubby parts and expecting them to hold the support for that crown, it's odd that we really thought these things would hold up. And again, it's not a fun day in a dental office when the screw breaks on a screw retained implant crown. But when you look at it from this perspective, you think it was kind of bold of us to consider that little screw system would hold up the mass of that molar crown. And I didn't have many do this. I'm not going to bash these things. They serve their place, but it can happen. And more often than not, the crown just came loose or the screw came loose because it's just not a well-designed system. And then when I heard it didn't have FDA validation, it kind of made me nervous and we backed off of them. So I switched over to this product, which is called Atlantis Custom Base. And what it did was it went on the history and FDA validation, all the research and data of Atlantis. And they just modified an Atlantis abutment, a custom abutment, into a screw retained version. And what they did was they gave the labs a little bit more flexibility and latitude with how the coronal part, right? Whatever we needed for crown support, we had a little bit more tweak with it. We could move the screw hole a little bit more, and we could get the file with the screw hole in it. So it allows us to do a screw retain Atlantis abutment, right? Which is truly customized, right? And again, we're going back to why we're talking about best solutions for single tooth abutment, and it's a tissue emergence, right? And I want the customization to begin at the implant interface. Right? Stock parts don't do that, right? The customization begins at the margin of the stock part, but a true custom abutment, it begins at the interface. So I want customization of angle, position, how far out, what shape it is. Nothing's perfectly round, nothing's perfectly oval or tri-oval, right? We got to match it to the tissue. So the only way to do that is to use a fully customizable implant system like Atlantis. And this just gave us a screw retained version of it. So once we started using these, we really started seeing a greater success, with our single tooth screw retained solutions. And I look at this graphic and I think about it and wonder about all those stock parts, right? And this is just a representation of a stock tie base, right? Where I might use that thing because it's a third of the cost and make a bicuspid crown over it. And I look at it like this and I think, wow, that was just not super smart because emergence profile is not where it should be, right? The support of the crown is certainly not where it needs to be. All that space above the occlusal surface of the abutment is scary. The hole certainly isn't in an ideal position, but implants are not going to be placed ideally every time. I mean, we have to deal with those things. And having the ability to customize everything from that interface up and give the crown the support it needs is really the only way I would want a single tooth implant in my head. So that's my favorite way of doing it. And I get asked a lot, what do we use or what would you use to cement everything together? And I like, these are two of the most popular. I would be okay with either one of them. I went to Lowe's and bought these little, the little clamps. They make them in about a 6-inch size, and they're perfect for holding crowns and abutments together while the cement sets up. Now, I think this was the reason that we moved away from screw retained crowns in the beginning was we got tired of dealing with this hole. And in the beginning, we would just, peel some cotton out of a cotton roll and pack it down in there and then cover that with composite. And today we've gotten much better, right? We're using Teflon tape because cotton does not hold up well because the composite that we seal up with never going to seal most crowns up 100%. And so if there's any micro leakage and you ever have to uncover it, then you see that cotton and it's black and gunky and nobody wants that. So Teflon tape is the answer. Again, it's $1 a roll at Home Depot, and it's a great solution, right? We ball it up, pack it in there, Colored Teflon tape, why would you need another color? I recommend you use a different colored Teflon tape when you're doing something like an angulated screw access, or you're using something that has a unique screw or tool that you might need to remember to use. That way, if it gets ever uncovered, you wonder, why is the tape pink? Oh, yeah, let's look in the chart. Oh, that's why we need that angulated screw to get this off. And so that's what we do today. We ball up a piece of Teflon tape and, we just cover it up with a better composite, maybe a stronger posterior composite, polish it up, and we're good to go. So, we've customized everything except the placement, right? And so Atlantis carries it one step further, and they've created this custom seating jig, which I love because it's custom 3D printed to each specific abutment fabricated by Atlantis, goes all the way down to the margin, which is fantastic when you're chair side and you're trying to get these custom abutments which fit the tissue intimately, right? You're trying to get them all the way down and to get the screw turned a time or two. Well, this sleeve around the abutment kind of helps push that tissue out of the way. So we actually get a custom seating, and we can hold it down there while we get a couple of turns and get everything started. Apologize, I'm not sure what's going on with that video, but it's just showing that in action. Now, moving that to digital, right? And in more of a complete digital workflow, even though a lot of what I described is certainly digital, right? But you may not have ever seen it, right? You might have taken a traditional impression, sent it to the lab, and the lab would put the scan post in the model, and they would send that scan off to Atlantis to get that abutment made. But we're going to move that, more and more into the operatory. And so when we move our implant restorations over to the digital space, what are we talking about? Well, wonder why am I showing, a cotton harvest field? And well, I am from the South and I have friends that are farmers. And one of my dear friends, he's a fourth generation. And one of my favorite times is in the spring when he's planting cotton, and I go out and ride in the planter with him, and other in the fall when he's harvesting. And I've watched him over the years. And what he's told me is that how the yield per acre of whether it's the cotton or the wheat he's growing has quadrupled since his great grandfather, and how is that? Well, if you watch his technology and his equipment, and I watch what he does, and I come up in the tractor with him, and I see all this technology and digital stuff. And he literally has a tractor that plants 13 rows across, that is digitally controlled, satellite controlled, GPS, that drives itself across a field that's almost 1.5 miles across and never wavers, and replants the seed to within a 1/4 inch of where it was last year. And it just blows me away. I think, if a high-tech redneck farmer can do this, why can't we do it in dentistry? And of course, we are doing things just as impressive in dentistry. But it's fascinating to watch how that comes and goes, right? And in the fall, when he's harvesting, he is driving the harvester, but the machine is weighing, measuring the pH, measuring the moisture content, and a couple of other tests of the harvested cotton fibers. And it's storing that data and attaching it to the GPS data, so that when he comes back to this field in the summer to lay down fertilizer, all that data is compiled into the spreader to know where to lay more, where to lay less of the fertilizer. So if there's a part of one field even that might only be 50 by 50 yards that produce less cotton or weaker cotton, then the fertilizer knows to put more fertilizer there because of all this data. So I think it's time for better data for us guys, right? And for years and years and years, right, I always used impressions. And one of my main jobs was to go out and help folks take better impressions for implants. Because if that's not done right, we know we have an issue at seating time. And, I'm surprised over the years that as scanners started to show up in more and more offices, how even when offices had scanners, they still seem to gravitate over to, polyethers or polyvinyls to take the implant impressions. That's changing quickly. I think now that the adoption rate has really skyrocketed with intraoral scanners in dental offices, that's really changed because, they've proven themselves with hard tissue. We know that we can do crown and bridge successfully with an intraoral scanner and do it easily and quickly. So when I look at this impression, right, I want you to think about if this is your case tomorrow morning, and you've got 8 implants and you've got all the parts and pieces associated with that, right? And you've got the patient in the chair, and you've got to make sure everything is screwed in just right. So you got to do the bite, you got to do all those things. You got to make sure the moisture is controlled. You might even have to do retraction, and then you have to make sure the impression is captured accurately. You got to engage all those neurals on those posts. That is it's an anxiety driven impression. There's no doubt about it. It's a challenge to get that done. But when we move to digital, we can now take scan posts, right, and place into these implant sites and scan with the wand and pretty much eliminate traditional impressions for implant. And now we're at the level of technology that we can do this in single tooth every single day, totally predictable, easy, quick. But we're moving down into larger, like 3-unit, 6-unit, and now even full arch restorations using an intraoral scanner, which is absolutely the way we all want to go, right? If it's accurate and it's quick and it works, right? So much better to not have to worry about mixing up goop to put in there and wondering if it's right or accurate. We can take our time. We don't have to hurry, right? Because we can have a cup of coffee and come back and scan the other two. So there's options to do this, right? If you have a scanner, right, there are options out there that says, hey, I'm going to put something in the mouth. I'm going to scan it. I'm going to go over to my software and I'm going to create something. Then I'm going to go over to a mill or a printer. I'm going to get an output of that restoration. And I'm going to go back to the patient and I'm going to put it all in. You can do it totally in office. That is done. And there's certainly systems out there you can get to do that, but it's not the most popular. I can tell you all the data points to about 92% of folks do it other ways, and only about 8% do that totally in office, because there's a lot of work, right? There's a lot of technical work and a lot of lab type work, but it can be done, right? You know, we can use software, we can use hardware, we can use parts we can buy. And I apologize, videos seem to be they were running this afternoon. But then we can put the blocks in, right? And we can mill everything out. And this is kind of what that system looks like, right? We buy a stock part like a top base. We might make a custom abutment top and then make a crown to go on top of that, mill it out of our milling machine, right? But then we have to have a furnace, and there's all sorts of things that have to be done, right? It's pretty much a lab in there. And, you know, I'm just saying that it's doable, right? And, here's just a couple videos to show you that process in action. And if you were doing this in office, this is what you would need a cone beam, right? We start there. We use the scanner till we capture the data. So we're capturing the patient's existing data. We haven't placed anything yet, right? Now in the planning, right, we're going to plan for the restoration. So we put a crown into place, and then we use the software to say, okay, where does the implant need to be to support that? And so we have the bone information, we have the nerve information, the sinus information, the tissue information, right? We have the surrounding dentition information, all great data we need to make a good plan. And we use that software to make that plan for placement. Now, from that software, we can say, okay, let's make sure we get it right. So the software will actually generate the guide for us, same software. And so we can generate the guide, right? And we can actually mill that out of an in-office mill. Right? If we want to do all this, again, 7-8% of you out there doing it, and that's okay. Majority of you would rather, have some technician help on that, but it's okay. And so you mill the guide, you put the sleeve in, and then you're ready to bring the patient back in and place the implant, right? And the systems are also well structured with the data that we're putting in it, so it's all digital integrated, right? And so it's kind of hard to mess this up. Now, I'm not saying you can go buy the stuff tomorrow and go do it tomorrow. You got to have the training, but the guides, even with a single tooth up front where you can feel and see and palpitate the bone, you're not laying a flap. You might make a small incision and boom, you're placing that implant, in a pretty short amount of time. Now, what you do after that is optional, right? We could cover that up and, put a flipper or, just, let the patient heal. But sometimes the patient wants a tooth. And so we could make something temporary on top of that. Right. But we can also take an impression and go ahead and get started on the final if we feel like the tissue's good. But ideally, you can let that tissue heal up. So we're going to do something as a temporary to get that tissue healed up. We've already been through that. At some point, though, we're going to scan, right? And once everything's done, we're going to put the scan post in the implant. And then we're going to take that data over to our software. We're going to design the final restoration and then deliver. So in reality, this can be done in 3 or 4 appointments in a relatively short period of time, depending on the healing of the implant. But because we customized everything from the plan forward, the result is good. And that's what we're looking to do. And that's the beauty of digital. Now, when you throw in all the latest technology, there's so many cool things we can do, not only with mills, but with printers. So this is a new printer on the market that's totally modularized, right? So there's a cartridge of resin, right? And so you just kind of plug the cartridge into the cassette holder and it goes into the printer, right? And the little orange, I call it water pitcher, right? That's the print platform, right? So we're going to take the print platform and, load it in there. And this is what happens, right? You just push go and everything is totally contained in the printer. So it's not messy. And so the little T pitcher goes in there, and this is what happens. The cartridge tilts up, the resin comes out. And so, we could say, the lab could design, or you could design, I think it's going to be a night guard. It could be a surgical tray. It could be a guide. And, it's printed in a 3D printer, right? And after it comes out of the printer, then it stays in that T pitcher, right? It goes into the second box, which is a wash and cure station. So all the alcohol and all the light cure, everything's inside that box. So it's really not messy. And I'm showing you this just to say how far technology has come and how cool it is to see how 3D printing has really advanced, that, it's not the sticky mess as it once was. And this is just only going to continue to get more and more better, because when that thing comes out of that printer, it's already printed, cleaned, cured, dried, and you really just have to smooth and polish it off. So that's a pretty cool system. It's been fun watching that. Now, this is the totally in-office, materials we're talking about. So this is the CEREC. This, by the way, was the only tie-based screw retain solution that had FDA validation, as I mentioned earlier. To me, it's a little bit of a struggle at times, because the scan cap, if you don't have it lined up just right, you see that little line, everything's got to be lined up just right, or the data is flawed, and that means the crown and things not going to fit well. So you just got to take your time and be careful with it. But the software walks you right through it. The step-by-step on the screens make it all pretty easy on designing everything. So you can see us going through the abutment design first, and then the crown over it, so we can see, where everything is and how to smooth everything out, how to get our emergence profile. But, even with this, the customization only begins at the margin of that abutment, not at the interface. So again, this is not my favorite way to do it, because I think it creates a potential for, I call it a shelf or a shoulder of a crown or restoration coming up out of the tissue, where, bacteria can start to grow. And, that's where we start to get this loss that kind of all brought us here. Now, the second method that a dentist could do is say, look, I've got an intraoral scanner, but I have no interest of designing and milling and doing all that. So I want to scan it, but I want to send it out somewhere. And there's two paths, right? So this first path is that the clinician could scan it and send it to an abutment manufacturer somewhere and say, hey, I need an abutment, and pay them to design it, right? They would design it, and they would send the design back to the clinician. So you got to have the software, and you got to, have the time, and you got to check your email a lot to know that, okay, your design's here, come approve it, because they won't mail it without approval. So you got to check the boxes, right? And you got to be willing, and, you want to do that. But once you do that, you send that approval back, then they'll go, to milling your abutment and then sending it back to you, so that you can then, you could either send that file on to a lab to get a crown made, or if you had a mill in your office, you could mill that crown using data, again, digital data of the abutment. Again, that's part of the 8% out there that are doing that. 92% of dentists who do digital implant workflows send it to a laboratory. And a partner like NDX, it not only does it really well, but I think they do it super affordable. It just makes sense, right? And it just makes sense to continue down the doctor lab path. And when you're in that workflow, all you're going to do is pick your wand up, put the scan post in the implant, scan it, and send that file to your laboratory. And the laboratory is going to do all that back and forth and checking and making sure that the abutment meets your standards and meets your preferences. So they'll do all that. They know what you like and want and need, and they're going to do that. And then the abutment can be sent back to them, and they can design and mill the crown. Or it could be a hybrid version of that, where they could do the abutment part and send the file over to the dental office that might have a mill that they can mill it. And so the decision becomes, right, which workflow do I want? Well, I think you got to, do the math, right? And do the math of the time, right? And the cost. I can tell you from experience, right? Doing, 20, 30 of these a day, that we can do them pretty quick, right? A lab tech can sit down in front of a computer and get that abutment ordered from your scan in under 10 minutes, right? Because they do 20 a day. In a dental office, you may do one a month, two a month, right? One every couple of months. And so getting it out, getting the workflow down, is repetition, just like anything else. And if you're not doing it repetitively, it's going to be hard to get into a flow. So typically what I see in a dental office that wants to do this totally within their own office, that it's more like a 30 or 45-minute appointment just to get the scan sent off, and then all the secondary steps that have to be done. So in my opinion, the lab workflow is more efficient for the dentist because of the time the dentist saves that they can go into the next operatory and cut another tooth down or do another procedure. I think the billables go way up when the doctor does those kind of things. And the cost is really not big of a savings. It really isn't. I mean, for $50, is it really worth it for you to spend all that time in front of a computer? Not to de-emphasize anybody that likes doing it, right? I've met the dentists that love doing it, and that's cool. You're really technicians at heart, and that's great. But again, 92% of it done in a laboratory. So I would stick with what seems to be working, what's the most efficient. So that's kind of how we've moved into the digital. Now, some of you out there may be thinking, I kind of like to place implants, right? And maybe you've talked to an implant rep and okay, what do I got to do, right? Well, of course you got to be trained, but most of the implant companies can help you with that. But then they start talking about what you need, right? You got to have this surgical drill, right? You got to have an inventory of parts, right? I got to have some various sizes of implants back in my stock room so that when I get in there, I make sure I have the right part. So we're not, drilling a hole in the bone and waiting. You got to have the tools and resources to do all that. And that just kind of, turns some people off. And the big kits that you have to have, all those things. Well, what Dentsply did with this Azento product is they basically put all that stuff in one box for one implant. So, and they threw in the digital plan and the abutment, anything that you need here, right, is in this box. And so that leaves the dentist to doing scanning, confirming and make sure the implant is in the right spot, and then treating, the patient can be done in little as, 3 or 4 visits. So it's kind of how this workflow works. And there are others like this, but you're going to start with a scan. And that's kind of how all the digital workflow has to start, a scan in your office. Now, in the implant workflows, that's typically 2 scans, right? A CBCT scan and an intraoral wand scan. So you're going to take those 2 scans and you're going to go to some portal, some website, and you're going to upload those 2 scans, and you're going to indicate, and with the Azento, it's like 2 pages of very, very simple answers. What tooth? What am I trying to do? Kind of thing. Upload the files, right? And with the Azento, at least, what happens is that VAD design takes over, and a designer will get real involved in these, right? And they'll make sure everything's right. And then they will say, okay, in less than 24 hours, we're going to send you the scan data, and we're going to send you the placement data, right? We want you to check it, right? And you can check it on your phone, you can check it on your tablet, you can check it on your desktop. But it's basically saying, this is what our software has said the ideal placement and size and type of implant, right? You approve. And of course, you have the final say so, and you approve. So all that happens, within 24 hours after you scan the patient. Once you approve it, then it takes them 2, 3, 4 days to pull everything together. What they're going to do is go pull that implant. They're going to use the digital software to create a surgical guide for you, custom to your patient, right? They're going to create, get all the drills that you need, and they're going to put all that in one box. And, this is what you get, right? You have your drills, you have your actual implant, you have your custom surgical guide, you have a wonderful custom healing abutment that was digitally designed and created from the data of your scans. So it's VAD created. It's not created by me chairside or by a technician or by you having to worry about it chairside. And it's custom sculpting the tissue to that ideal position. And if you want, you can ask for a final full-size abutment as well if you want to put a temporary crown on it. This is a wonderful workflow for a single tooth. Now, again, you got to be educated, right? You want to get comfortable and understand the aspects of placing implants. But, once you do that, you can use a kit like this and not have to have an inventory, right? You're only ordering, stuff as you need it, one case at a time. And so you'd seek that healing abutment, send the patient out for healing of bone and tissue, whatever that took, 4, 6, 8 weeks. Then, they come back, and if the tissue's good, you may not even have to scan it again because that data already exists. The data that created the custom healing abutment is the same data that they can use to make the final abutment, right? And if the tissue didn't recede, then you don't have to scan it again. If it did, you just take another quick scan and send that off, go back to the same portal and say, I'm ready for my final abutment now. And they'll throw up the list of labs, right? And you'll see your NDX lab in there, and you'll send them the data and say, okay, I'm ready for my final abutment. So that's the Azento. That makes kind of things really contained digitally, but still in one box. So you have all the parts and pieces. So what we've done is we've kind of come full circle, right? We start with a scan. It goes to a lab designs stuff. They get stuff fabricated or they fabricate stuff themselves, and then the dentist delivers. So it's kind of a 2 appointment process for you, with the lab doing all the lifting work, of the data. This was a system that I had developed in my career, where we partnered with some specialists, right, that we worked with on implants. So I had, I think, about 8 surgeons and about 4 periodontists around the Carolinas that, we worked with the scanner companies, and we got the scanner that they wanted in their offices, and our specialists would place the implants, put the scan post in there and scan it, and then send the file to the laboratory. Right. And all they wanted to do was place implants. They didn't get any fee for this. They didn't ask for any fee for this. The GP got all the billing for the implant restoration. So when I got these scans from my specialist partners, I would call the GP and say, okay, I have your patient's case. I know we've already chatted about what kind of restoration. I just need to confirm what shades you want. Let's confirm the restoration. I can tell you the data is good. And so I'd have that quick conversation, and we would go about doing what lab guys do. And we would take that data and we would have the abutment made, and we would build the crown. And we could deliver this in a pretty quick turnaround, right? Because it was all in one tight digital circle. And to me, that is the preferred ideal workflow, for an implant restoration, right? And now the GP could certainly have the scanner and do that in his office, right? Which means go to the surgeon, get your implant, come back here. I'm going to put the post in, I'm going to scan you. But that turned out to be a great workflow for the surgeons, for the GPs that don't want to deal with anything other than screwing the abutment in and cement and putting the crown on top. Then, that's a good workflow. It worked out well for us. Now, when you start scanning for implant abutments, right, you got to be aware of a few things. Number one, what is the size and type of implant that I'm restoring? Because you need to do this ahead of time. You have to have the right scan post. None of these scan posts are interchangeable. For example, if you have a Straumann or Nobel implant and you want an Atlantis abutment, you have to have an Atlantis scan post. You can't say, I'm going to put this Straumann scan post in, but I want Atlantis abutment, or vice versa, right? I'm going to put this Atlantis abutment in, but I want a Straumann abutment. That doesn't work that way. You have to use their scan post. So you just have to know that ahead of time, right? And just talk with your lab. NDX is really good about their digital team can train you on this process of scanning these scan posts, helping you get the right scan post. But always ask that question, before the patient's in the chair, to ensure that you have the right scan post. I used to have to tell you that you need to make sure that your scanner can recognize the scan post. Most of that's been worked out. Our current generation of scanners have gotten really, really good, and have the data inside of them that they need to recognize these scan posts. But just as a side note, just make sure your scanner knows what that scan post is. And then, of course, the labs that you're using, they need to be able to recognize those scans of those scan posts. And again, current generation, that's really not a problem anymore. So pick the one you like, right? They're all pretty good, right? You just got to find one that's good in your hands. And they all do implant scanning really well, right? There's nothing wrong with any of the major systems. Again, NDX has one of the best teams in the country to help you with intraoral scanners. They have a team, nationwide team, that will actually train you, help you, support you on the scanning of stuff, right? And again, as things advance, right, we see different scan posts. Like this is something called a Flow S, and it's a cylindrical, which is odd. Everything else has a kind of a feature. But this thing has 5,000, 10,000 microcrystals on it, which really means it captures a lot of data. So this is the current generation, the most accurate scan post. So if I have something that accurate as a scan post, and I have a wand that's super, super accurate as they are today, then now we can start to do more and bigger things, right? So this is a scan post that actually allows you, the dentist, to put 3, 4, 6, 8 of them in the mouth, scan it, send that data to the lab. It has to go through the lab, and the lab has to do a scan upload. It's a pretty big file movement thing. But anyway, because the data is so good, the substructure for the bridge can be 3D printed. It's actually called selective laser melting. Pretty fantastic piece of equipment. So it's super accurate. Then the digital file of that can be sent back to the lab so they can create the top, the zirconia top, right, in the digital workflow. And then, by the time they finish that, the framework comes in the FedEx box, and they glue the two parts and pieces together, and you've got a screw retained 3-unit bridge, and all you did was take a scan. There's no secondary appointment to verify that impression. This things can be done without a model if we want to. It's so accurate. So that's kind of how far we've become right? As far as scanning digital, for implants. Now, when we move into full arch, we can talk about regular dentures, right? We can talk about overdentures, which we call removable tissue supported. We can talk about full arch fixed, which are totally implant borne, right? And those are kind of the common things that we see. And then there's one that you may not be aware of that's called full arch fixed removable, right? Meaning that it's a fully implant borne restoration, but it is removable. Why would you want that? Well, let's say I need a flange, bone loss. The patient can't afford fixed. This is a lower cost alternative, but yet it feels like fixed. So those are the three options. We'll go through them quickly, right? And I always start with the patient, right? What do you want? What do you like? What do you not like about what you have now? And this was a patient who had an all-on X case that every time she smiled big, if she had a big smile, laugh, her upper lip would get caught between the restoration and her tissue, and she'd have to reach up and pull it down. So she needed more acrylic up there. And obviously we can't do that with a fix because she couldn't clean it. So we move into digital workflows where we start doing these really cool scans and planning and designing and printing of prototypes and using that data to go to final, even with the fabrication of a bar or substructure. And we can end up with a restoration that's not only fantastic, but we can seat it a whole lot quicker because of all this data that we're using. And then you throw in photogrammetry, and it's just better data. It's more data. And all these things they just use a specialized camera, specialized markers to really dial in the position of the implant so that we can build a restoration on top of that, and it'll go to seat. I mean, our conversion appointments are getting down to basically nothing because of all this fantastic data that we're getting from these devices. And so we can make things digitally, we can make them better, we can make them fit. So here's that scan post and a full arch. We can make a final full arch fixed restoration from an intraoral scan today successfully. So again, guided, we've already talked about this, right? It's just a workflow where we start with a scan of the arch and add a CBCT, goes to a software. Number two, we design and we plan everything. We use that data to generate a surgical guide. Number three, we use that surgical guide to place that implant perfectly. Number four, and then we're ready to put a scan post in to make the final. So it's not complicated. It can be intimidating, but I think you ought to be using guided surgery workflows on all your implant cases, whether it's single tooth or full arch like this, because of the data that makes everything line up perfectly parallel, everything we need to do for a successful result. You realize how late it was getting, so I need to wrap it up here. I want to finish off with using your intraoral scanner and other things to communicate with the patient. They may be coming through. So we want to get the patient to say yes. You want to be able to communicate accurately to your lab. And, we want to be able to do some sort of provisional or prototype. So, getting the patient to say yes, it always starts there. We've got to have that. So there are things out there like the DSD app, wonderful app that you can use to do what I call the wow try-in. And it's simply taking pictures and using this app and software and showing the patient this is what it's going to look like, right? And it looks so real, and it can, you have total customization of those teeth and the tissue and the colors and the placement. The Prime Scan has something called oral check that I really love, right? If you can scan my tooth today with the Prime Scan and I come back 6 months later, right, you can scan it again, and using the OraCheck app in the scanner, show me what's changed, whether it's tissue loss or volume measurement in the tooth or cross sections, anything like that, tooth movements. It's all part, right, of the software that comes with the scanner. And so I look at that and say, oh, what's that purple thing about? And your hygienist would say to me, oh, that's where you've got some tissue recession. So we could start, on a program. It sells more dentistry when you can show me. Communicating to labs, digital, all these softwares that we have, how are we communicating to labs, right? More and more labs are texting back and forth with their dentists and staff. Of course, we always have the phone. You want to talk about shade, right? How do you do that, right? Pictures, photographs, cell phones. We have all sorts of tools, right? So what I love about the digital workflows is, all right, so here's a lab technician sitting in front of a case, and she wants to ask the doctor about the margin. So there he is looking at the same case, and they're having that conversation about, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to fix this? but they're both looking at the same thing. And, with COVID, we now know about all these things and how we can communicate with each other clearly, visibly. And again, all part of the digital process, right? Where we can use all these tools and we can see all these things and we can show these things to our patients, and we can really, really amp up our practice. So it's not just a scanner of tooth preps, right? We can use it, for communication, right? And helping things move along. So if I take this digital plan like this DSD, right? We showed this patient, look, this is what you can look like. She says, great. I think I would like to try that. Let's make those, right? And so we can make temporaries, right? We could take this data, right? And I can transfer that data to a digital mock-up, right? And we can see the differences and we can work on it in the computer, right? And then all we got to do is copy and paste it over to a printer, right? We can print it out, right? We can print a model and we can make a mock-up if we want to do it with chairside composite, right? And so this actual mock-up this doctor did with chairside composite using a printed model and a putty matrix, right? So this patient got to go home for a couple of days and wear this mock-up, right? And then came back. Of course, he sold that case, right? She was in love with it, and moving to the final pretty easy, right? Because we already have the data. And if you make any tweaks in the mock-up, we can scan that, integrate that with the design, and move to the final. So, doing that digitally just makes it so much easier, faster, and better.
With that, we get to bid you adieu. Any closing remarks, Jimmy?
No, I'm almost 66 years old, and it's hard to believe how excited I get about digital, but I do. The digital dentures is a big thing in my world right now. But, intraoral scanning, the first time I saw it, I thought, oh, that is fantastic. But obviously, the first one I saw was the CEREC, right? And so that was that complete system in the dental office. And, the guy was making his own crowns. And I told him, said, I don't like that part of it, right? But that scanner part, I think every dentist in the world is going to want one of these one day, right? Because, at that time I'd been around dentists for 20 or 30 years, and I knew that, most dentists are going to want that scanner. That's pretty good. And they want to send it to a lab and let the lab do what they do. And I thought everybody's going to have one of these one day. I thought it would happen quicker. But for the longest time, it was under 20% of the dentists in the country had it. But I think COVID really put a jump start on that. And now the question I've asked at all my programs over the last 30 years is, how many of you have an intraoral scanner? And for, again, a long time it's under 20%, but now it's 70, 80, 90% of people in the room have an intraoral scanner now. So it's exciting, and it makes for better dentistry, guys. And so if you haven't gotten one yet, you need to contact with one of these folks and get them to come by and let you play with it and get a feel for it, because it really, really makes dentistry better, but it also makes it fun again. Right. And I encourage you to get one and keep it in the hands of all your staff. Right. I joke with my hygienist all the time. I said, you've never scanned my teeth. Right. And I think every hygienist ought to scan every new patient. Right. Because if you'd scanned it, you would probably show me my rotated lateral, and you would say to me, we could make you some aligners and we could fix that if you wanted to. And I joked with her. I said, don't tell the dentist. Right. Because I've been going this way and every 6 months, and you've never said it. You never scanned me. And but you would have sold me. I would have bought an aligner case in a minute, because now I'm 66. I don't really care anymore, but they should be scanning everybody. So don't let it sit in the corner and wait on crown and bridge cases, guys. Use it for everything.
Well, good night, audience. We do appreciate you being with us. We look forward to joining us again soon. And in the meantime, take care of those patients. And don't forget to tell us how we can take care of you on that survey that's about to pop up.